The rain poured heavily that night, drumming against the pavement in a steady rhythm. Streetlights flickered in the distance, casting eerie shadows over the quiet neighborhood. It was supposed to be just another ordinary evening for 17-year-old Jake Carter, a high school senior with a spotless record and dreams of making it to college. But fate had other plans. Jake was walking home from his part-time job at the local diner, his hoodie pulled up against the cold drizzle. He had just finished a late shift, exhausted but satisfied, knowing he was saving up every penny for school. His mother always told him hard work paid off, and he believed her. He was the kind of kid who never got into trouble, polite, responsible, and focused on his future. That's what made what happened next so unbelievable. As he turned the corner onto his street, red and blue lights suddenly flooded the darkness. A police cruiser screeched to a stop, its tires splashing water onto the sidewalk. Before Jake could react, an officer jumped out, flashlight in hand, his face stern and unyielding. "You! Stop right there," the officer barked, his voice cutting through the rain. Confused, Jake froze, his heart pounding. He glanced around, expecting to see someone else, but there was no one. The officer was talking to him. "Hands where I can see them," the cop ordered, stepping closer. Jake slowly raised his hands, his mind racing. "Officer, is something wrong?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied Jake like he was looking for something, some sign of guilt. Then, in a tone that sent a chill down Jake's spine, he said, "You fit the description of a suspect in a robbery earlier tonight." Jake's breath caught in his throat. A robbery? Him? That didn't make any sense. He had been at work for hours. There had to be some mistake. "Sir, I just got off work," Jake said, trying to stay calm. Turn around. Hands behind your back," the officer interrupted. Panic surged through Jake. He had never been in trouble before, never even spoken to the police other than the friendly officer who visited his school once to talk about safety. And now he was being treated like a criminal. "Wait, please," Jake pleaded, trying to explain. "I have proof, my boss." But it didn't matter. Cold metal snapped around his wrists, locking tightly. The weight of the handcuffs sent a jolt of fear through his body. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore, it was real. By the time Jake arrived at the station, word had already spread. His mother showed up, her face a mixture of fear and disbelief. "There has to be a mistake," she kept saying, but no one listened. The officers were convinced they had their guy. Then came the worst part. A detective walked in, holding a folder, his eyes scanning Jake with scrutiny. "We have a witness who says they saw you running from the scene," the detective said. Jake's stomach twisted. A witness? That was impossible. "I wasn't there," he said firmly. "I swear, I was at work the whole time." But the detective didn't look convinced. "We'll see," he muttered before walking out. That night, Jake sat alone in the holding cell, the walls closing in on him. How had his life turned upside down in just a matter of hours? He wasn't a criminal. He was just a kid who wanted a better future. And yet, tomorrow, he would have to stand in a courtroom and defend himself against something he didn't do. What he didn't know was that the trial ahead would be nothing short of shocking. Secrets would unravel, truths would be twisted, and in the end, what happened in that courtroom would leave everyone speechless. Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people settled into their seats, some flipping through papers, others stealing curious glances at Jake. He sat stiffly beside his attorney, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if he might slip away if he let go. His mother sat behind him, her fingers laced together in her lap, her lips pressed tight to keep from breaking down. She had spent all night trying to convince herself that the truth would clear his name, but the justice system wouldn't fail an innocent kid. But deep inside, Jake could see the fear in her eyes. The judge entered, a stern-looking man with silver hair and a gaze that could cut through steel. Everyone stood, then sat as he adjusted his glasses and glanced over the papers before him. The prosecutor, a sharp-dressed man with a voice as smooth as glass, stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, the state will prove today that the defendant, Jake Carter, was seen fleeing the scene of a robbery, wearing the exact clothing described by a witness. We will also present security footage that shows a figure matching his build running from the store where the crime occurred." Jake swallowed hard. Security footage? That couldn't be right. He hadn't been anywhere near that store. His attorney, Miss Collins, a no-nonsense woman with years of experience, leaned toward him and whispered, "Stay calm. They're just laying out their argument. We'll break it down." Jake nodded, but his mind was racing. How could there be footage of someone who looked like him? The thought sent a wave of panic through him, but he forced himself to breathe. He had to trust the process. He had to believe that the truth would come out. The prosecution called their first witness, Officer Mitchell, the cop who had arrested Jake that night. He stepped up to the stand, his uniform neatly pressed, his face unreadable. The prosecutor paced in front of him, nodding as he spoke. "Officer Mitchell, can you describe the events of that evening?" The officer cleared his throat. "At approximately 9:30 p.m., I received a report of a robbery at the corner mart on Maple Street. The suspect was described as a young male, wearing a dark hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. As I was patrolling near the area, I saw the defendant walking alone, matching the description given." Jake's jaw clenched. A hoodie and jeans. That could be half the kids in the neighborhood. The prosecutor nodded. "And what happened when you approached him?" "He appeared nervous," the officer said. "When I questioned him, he seemed hesitant in his answers. Based on the description and his behavior, I detained him for further investigation." Jake could feel the weight of those words pressing down on him. Hesitant? Nervous? Who wouldn't be when a cop jumps out at them in the dark, demanding answers? Miss Collins stood. "Officer Mitchell, you stated that Jake appeared nervous. Isn't it true that many innocent people become anxious when confronted by law enforcement, especially when they don't know why they're being stopped?" The officer's expression didn't change. "That may be true, but in my experience, guilty individuals often show signs of nervousness as well." Miss Collins didn't flinch. "And yet, being nervous is not a crime, correct?" The officer hesitated. "No, it isn't." Jake felt a flicker of hope. His attorney wasn't backing down. Then came the next witness, the store clerk who had been working the register during the robbery. He was a thin man with glasses and jittery hands that fidgeted with the hem of his shirt as he spoke. "I saw him," the man said, his voice shaking slightly. "Or someone who looked just like him." Miss Collins immediately stood. "Objection. That's speculation." The judge nodded, sustained. "Please let me describe what you saw, not what you assume." The clerk licked his lips and tried again. "I was behind the counter when the suspect came in. He had his hood up. He pulled out something. I think it was a knife or maybe a gun. I don't know. It happened so fast. He told me to empty the register, and when I did, he grabbed the cash and ran." Jake's chest tightened. He could feel eyes on him, judging, assuming. Miss Collins approached the witness stand. "Mr. Rees, you just said the suspect had his hood up. How clearly could you see his face?" The clerk hesitated. "Not very well, but the way he walked, his height, it was close." "Close, but not certain." The clerk shifted. "I mean, no. I can't say for sure." Miss Collins turned to the jury, letting that moment sink in before stepping back to her seat. Then came the security footage. The courtroom held its breath as the grainy video played on the screen. A figure in a dark hoodie entered the store, lingered near the counter, and then, in a flash, grabbed the money and sprinted out. The camera was too low quality to make out a face, only a silhouette, a general build. The prosecutor turned to the jury. "There you have it. The suspect's appearance matches the defendant's. The height, the clothing, the way he moves, it all lines up." Jake could barely believe what he was hearing. The way he moves. Since when did movement prove someone guilty? Miss Collins stood, her face calm but determined. "Your Honor, I'd like to present an alibi for my client." The judge nodded, and she turned toward the back of the courtroom. "Please call Mr. Ray Perkins to the stand." Jake's boss, Ray, stepped forward, adjusting his name tag as he walked. He was a big guy, the kind of man who didn't waste time with nonsense. He sat down, straightened his back, and looked directly at the prosecutor. "Mr. Perkins," Miss Collins began, "can you tell the court where Jake Carter was on the night of the robbery?" Ray nodded. "He was at work, the whole time, from 5 in the evening till closing at 10, no doubt about it." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Jake felt his heart race. The prosecutor stepped forward. "Mr. Perkins, are you absolutely certain? Could he have left at any point?" "No way," Ray said firmly. "We were short-staffed that night. I needed him there every second, and I got the timesheets to prove it." Miss Collins held up a stack of papers. "Your Honor, these are Jake's time records, showing he clocked in at 5 and clocked out at 10. The robbery happened at 9:30. There is no possible way he could have committed this crime." The judge took the papers, flipping through them as the prosecutor frowned. "But we have an eyewitness," the prosecutor argued, "and the security footage shows a person in a hoodie," Miss Collins interrupted. "Not Jake Carter. No clear face, no distinguishing features. And now we have undeniable proof that my client was miles away at the time." Jake barely dared to breathe. This was it. This had to clear his name. The judge set down the papers and looked at the prosecutor. "Do you have any further evidence to dispute this alibi?" The prosecutor opened his mouth, then closed it. He glanced at the officer, at the store clerk, but no one had an answer. For the first time since this nightmare began, Jake felt the weight on his shoulders lighten just a little. But then, just as the tension in the room shifted, the courtroom doors burst open. A young woman rushed in, her face pale, her hands clutching something tightly. "Wait," she called out. "I have something you need to see." Every head turned. The judge raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" The woman took a breath. "I'm the real witness, and I know who actually committed the robbery." A stunned silence filled the room. Jake turned toward his attorney, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. What did this woman know? And why had she waited until now to come forward? Everything was about to change. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. All eyes were on the young woman standing near the doors, her breath uneven, her fingers clutched tightly around a small black notebook. Jake turned in his seat, his pulse pounding. Who was she? And why was she only speaking up now? The judge straightened in his chair, adjusting his glasses as he addressed her. "Miss, you cannot simply interrupt court proceedings. If you have information relevant to this case, step forward and state your name." She hesitated for a moment before making her way to the front of the courtroom. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes held determination. "My name is Lacey Harper," she said. "I was there that night. I saw what really happened." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. The prosecutor glanced at her with suspicion. "Miss Harper, are you saying you witnessed the robbery?" She nodded, "Yes." Miss Collins stepped forward, her voice steady. "Then why haven't you come forward until now?" Lacey swallowed hard. "Because I was scared. I didn't want to get involved, but I can't stay quiet anymore. You have the wrong person." She turned toward Jake. "He didn't do it." Jake's heart slammed against his ribs. Someone was finally standing up for him, but he had no idea what she was about to say. The judge sighed. "Very well, Miss Harper, take the stand." As she walked to the witness stand and was sworn in, Jake noticed how she avoided looking at the prosecutor. Her hands fidgeted with a notebook in her lap. "Tell us what you saw," Miss Collins said. Lacey took a deep breath. "I was walking home from work that night. I cut through the alley behind the corner mart, like I always do. I heard shouting from inside the store, so I hid behind a dumpster. A few seconds later, I saw a guy run out." "Did you see his face?" Miss Collins asked. Lacey hesitated. Not fully, but I know one thing, it wasn't him. She pointed at Jake. The guy I saw was taller and had a different build. He ran right past me, and when he turned the corner, he pulled off his hoodie. That's when I saw his hair. It was buzzed short, not like his. She motioned to Jake's slightly longer curls. Jake felt a jolt of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by doubt. Would this be enough? The prosecutor crossed his arms. Miss Harper, you say you didn't see the suspect's face clearly. Then how can you be sure it wasn't the defendant? Lacey's grip on the notebook tightened, because I saw something else too. She flipped it open, revealing a piece of paper tucked inside. When the guy ran, something fell out of his pocket. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I picked it up. When I heard about Jake's arrest, I checked it again. She held it up. It's a receipt from a gas station, time-stamped just 10 minutes before the robbery. Miss Collins stepped closer. Whose name is on it? Lacey looked down at the slip. It's paid with a credit card. Name on it says, Brian Lasky. A sharp intake of breath echoed from the back of the courtroom. Jake didn't recognize the name, but from the reaction of some of the people in the audience, someone did. The prosecutor snatched the receipt from Lacey's hand, examining it with a frown. He looked back at the officer who had arrested Jake, who suddenly looked uncomfortable. Do you know this name? Miss Collins asked. Officer Mitchell hesitated before responding. Brian Lasky has a record. Jake's fingers dug into his chair. A record. Miss Collins raised an eyebrow. And did anyone bother to investigate him before arresting my client? The prosecutor cleared his throat. We received an eyewitness identification of Mr. Carter. At the time, the case seemed clear. Miss Collins wasn't backing down. And yet, this Brian Lasky had his credit card used minutes before the robbery, right near the crime scene. That's a coincidence, don't you think? The judge rubbed his temple. I think we need to pause proceedings. The defense has presented new information that requires further investigation. Jake's heart pounded. Was this it? Would they finally look for the real suspect? But then the courtroom doors opened again. This time, 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. They whispered something to Officer Mitchell, who stiffened before quickly nodding. The prosecutor turned back to the judge. Your Honor, if I may, we just received word that Brian Lasky was taken into custody earlier this morning for an unrelated incident. During the arrest, officers found a stash of cash on him, matching the amount stolen from the corner mart. The entire courtroom erupted into gasps. Jake felt lightheaded. If they had arrested the real culprit, then... His thoughts were interrupted when the prosecutor straightened his tie and cleared his throat. Given this new development, the state is willing to reconsider the charges against Jake Carter. Jake barely registered what was happening. Miss Collins was speaking, the judge was responding, and his mother was crying behind him. But the words didn't fully sink in until the judge finally turned to him. Jake Carter, you are free to go. A wave of relief crashed over him, so overwhelming that for a moment he couldn't move. Then, slowly, the weight of everything lifted. His mother rushed to his side, wrapping him in a tight hug, her tears soaking into his shoulder. He closed his eyes, breathing in the moment. But even as he was led out of the courtroom, one thought remained. How close had he come to losing everything? And how many other innocent people never got their chance to prove the truth? Jake stepped out of the courthouse, the cool evening air hitting his face as if waking him from a bad dream. He was free, but instead of feeling relief, a strange unease settled in his chest. His name had been cleared, but everything had unraveled too fast. One moment, he had been fighting for his life, and the next, the real suspect was in custody. It almost felt too convenient. His mother held onto his arm tightly, as if afraid he might slip away again. Come on, sweetheart, she whispered. Let's go home. But Jake wasn't ready to move. His attorney, Miss Collins, stood nearby, speaking quietly with Lacey. He watched as Lacey nodded, her face pale, her fingers still gripping the notebook. She had changed everything with that one piece of evidence. Jake walked over, his voice hesitant. "Lacey, why did you come forward?" After waiting so long. She looked up at him, guilt flickering in her eyes. "Because I had to. I saw what happened. I knew it wasn't you." But she hesitated, lowering her voice. "I also knew Brian Lasky." Jake frowned. "You knew him?" Miss Collins folded her arms, watching Lacey carefully. "What aren't you telling us?" Lacey shifted on her feet, glancing over her shoulder as if making sure no one else was listening. "Brian, he's dangerous. I used to work at the same gas station where he used that credit card. I saw him around town a lot, always in trouble. Always looking over his shoulder like he knew something was coming for him." She swallowed. "When I saw his name on that receipt, I knew it had to be him. But I was afraid." Jake's stomach tightened. "Afraid of what?" Lacey hesitated before answering. "Afraid of who Brian was working for." A chill ran through Jake. "You mean he wasn't working alone?" She nodded. "Brian's been mixed up in something bigger. I don't know the details, but I heard things when he used to hang around the gas station. He'd talk about jobs, about people who didn't take kindly to mistakes. He always bragged about how he had protection, how no one would dare come after him." She took a shaky breath. If he was that confident, it means someone powerful was behind him. Miss Collins pressed her lips together. This could explain why the police were so quick to pin this on Jake. If Brian was protected by someone higher up, they wouldn't want the investigation leading back to them. Jake's mind raced. "Are you saying someone wanted me to take the fall?" Lacey nodded, "and they almost got away with it." Jake's chest tightened. He had thought the worst was over, but now it felt like something even bigger was lurking just out of sight. He had been accused of a crime he didn't commit, nearly lost his freedom, and now he was finding out that the real criminal might have connections that reached further than he could imagine. Miss Collins checked her watch. "We need to be careful. If Brian was working with someone else, and they realize he got caught, they might try to cover their tracks. That could mean silencing anyone who knows too much." Her gaze locked onto Lacey, "Including you." Lacey's face paled. "I thought turning in the receipt would be enough. But what if they come after me?" Jake's jaw clenched. "Then we find out who's behind this. If they try to frame me once, they could do it to someone else. We have to stop them." Miss Collins sighed. "That's not our job, Jake. The police should handle it." Jake shook his head. "The same police that arrested me without real evidence. No, I need answers." Lacey hesitated before whispering, "I might know someone who can help. But if we do this, we have to be careful." Jake looked at her, determination growing in his gut. He had barely escaped losing everything. Now he needed to make sure no one else would suffer the same fate. But deep down he knew this was only the beginning. Jake's mind raced as he and Lacey left the courthouse, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The air outside felt thick, charged with something unseen. He had spent weeks trapped in fear, fighting to prove his innocence, and now he was finally free. But the more he thought about it, the less it felt like a victory. Brian Lasky had been arrested, but it had all happened too fast. The case against Jake had crumbled in a single afternoon. If Brian was really working for someone else, what were the chances they would just let him take the fall without trying to cover their tracks? Lacey walked beside him, quiet and tense. She was the reason he was standing here instead of behind bars, but now she looked more afraid than ever. She had spoken up, but it was clear she knew more than she was saying. They reached the parking lot, and Miss Collins stopped beside her car, crossing her arms. "I don't like this," she admitted. "Brian being arrested is a good thing, but if he really was protected by someone higher up, they won't just let this go." Jake nodded. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of." Lacey hesitated before speaking. "I have a friend, someone who knows Brian. He used to run with the same crowd, but got out before things got too bad. He might have information." Miss Collins narrowed her eyes. "And you trust him?" Lacey bit her lip. "I don't know if I trust anyone right now, but if anyone can tell us who Brian was working for, it's him." Jake looked at her. Where is he? Lacey glanced around nervously, then pulled out her phone. He usually hangs out at an old auto shop on the east side of town. We can meet him there, but we have to be careful. Miss Collins sighed. Jake, you don't have to get involved in this. You just got your life back. Jake shook his head. I need answers. Reluctantly, Miss Collins gave them a ride to the auto shop. The place was nearly abandoned, a row of broken-down cars rusting outside, the street lights flickering dimly. Lacey led the way, stepping around shattered glass near the entrance. She knocked twice on the dented metal door. A moment later, it creaked open, revealing a man in his early 20s with sharp eyes and a cautious expression. Lacey. She nodded. Mason, we need to talk. Mason glanced at Jake and Miss Collins, then quickly stepped aside, letting them in. The shop was cluttered, tools scattered everywhere, the smell of oil thick in the air. Mason leaned against a workbench, arms crossed. I heard about Brian. Figured it was only a matter of time before he got himself caught. Lacey stepped forward. Who was he working for? Mason let out a bitter laugh. You think I'd still be breathing if I knew for sure? Brian never said names. But everyone knew he wasn't just some low-level thief. He was running jobs for someone big. Jake clenched his fists. Someone who had enough power to make sure I took the blame instead of him. Mason sighed, rubbing his temples. Look, I don't know who gave the orders, but I do know one thing. Brian wasn't scared of the cops. He was scared of someone else. Miss Collins frowned. And now that he's in custody. Mason's expression darkened. If he starts talking, he won't make it to trial. A heavy silence filled the room. Jake's stomach twisted. If Brian was silenced before he could reveal who was behind everything, then the truth might never come out. And if these people were powerful enough to manipulate the police, what else were they capable of? Lacey's voice was barely above a whisper. What do we do? Mason hesitated, then pulled a burner phone from his pocket. Brian had a contact. Someone who called him whenever there was a job. I managed to get one of the numbers he used. He held it out to Jake. You want answers? Start there. Jake took the phone, staring at the screen. A single number, no name. It was a risk, but he had come too far to back down now. Taking a deep breath, he pressed call. The line rang once, twice. Then someone picked up. And in a low, unshaken voice, they said, You shouldn't have done that. Jake's breath caught in his throat as the voice on the other end of the line spoke. It was calm, controlled, too controlled. Whoever this was, they weren't surprised to hear from him. They had been expecting this moment. You shouldn't have done that, the voice repeated. Jake tightened his grip on the phone. Who is this? A low chuckle. You're asking the wrong question, kid. The real question is, how far are you willing to go for the truth? Jake's pulse pounded. He could feel Lacey and Mason watching him, their faces tense with anticipation. Miss Collins had stepped closer, listening carefully. Why did you frame me? Jake asked, his voice steady despite the fear creeping up his spine. There was a pause. Then the voice said, Because you were easy. Jake's stomach twisted. What does that mean? It means you were the perfect distraction. We needed someone to take the fall, and you just happened to be in the wrong place at the right time. But now you're becoming a problem. A chill ran through Jake. This wasn't just about Brian anymore. This was bigger, carefully planned. Miss Collins suddenly reached forward and grabbed the phone from his hand. Listen to me, she said firmly. We know about Brian. We know he wasn't working alone. If you think you can scare us into dropping this, you're mistaken. A short silence, then a slow sigh. That lawyer of yours, she's smart, shame. The line went dead. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. Miss Collins stared at the phone, her expression unreadable. Lacey's hands trembled. Mason looked like he had seen a ghost. We need to leave, Miss Collins said quickly. Mason nodded, grabbing his jacket. If they know you're digging, you're already in danger. Jake's heart pounded as they rushed out of the shop. The night air felt sharper, the shadows deeper. Every sound made his skin crawl. They had kicked a hornet's nest. They got into Miss Collins' car, and she pulled away fast. "We're going to the police station. We need to report this." Jake clenched his fists. "The same police that almost locked me away." Miss Collins exhaled sharply. "We don't have a choice, Jake. We need protection. These people aren't just street criminals. They have power." Lacey hugged herself. What if they get to Brian before we do? No one had an answer. But as they neared the station, flashing red and blue lights came into view. An ambulance, officers running. Miss Collins slowed the car. Oh no. Jake's chest tightened as they pulled up. The scene was chaotic. Officers shouting, paramedics rushing. And then he saw him. Brian Lasky, on a stretcher, unmoving. Miss Collins threw the car into park, and they ran toward the scene. An officer stepped in their way. "You can't be here." "What happened?" Miss Collins demanded. The officer's expression was grim. Lasky was found in his holding cell. Someone got to him. Jake's stomach dropped. He had known they would try to silence Brian, but this fast. Lacey covered her mouth. Mason cursed under his breath. Miss Collins turned to Jake, her expression sharp. "That means we're next." A cold dread settled over Jake. They had tried to bury the truth before, and now they were coming for anyone who got too close. But Jake wasn't going to run. He was going to fight back. Jake stood frozen outside the police station, the flashing lights reflecting off his pale face. Brian Lasky was gone. The one person who could have exposed the truth had been silenced, just like the voice on the phone had warned. It wasn't just a threat. They had acted fast, too fast. That meant whoever was behind this was watching, waiting for the next move. Miss Collins pulled Jake by the arm, snapping him out of his daze. "We have to get out of here. Now." Jake let her drag him back to the car, his mind racing. Lacey and Mason scrambled in behind them, their hands shaking. No one spoke as Miss Collins pulled away from the scene, driving through the quiet streets. The city lights blurred past, but all Jake could see was Brian's unmoving body on that stretcher. Lacey's voice was barely a whisper. "What do we do now?" Jake swallowed hard. "They think they've won. That will back off." He clenched his fists. "But we can't." Miss Collins let out a breath. "Jake, these aren't small-time criminals. They have reach. If we don't handle this carefully, we could be in serious danger." Jake turned to her, his voice steady. "We're already in danger." A silence settled in the car. He was right. Running wouldn't change that. Mason shifted in his seat. There's one thing they didn't count on. Jake looked at him. "What?" Mason smirked. "Me." Lacey frowned. "What do you mean?" Mason pulled out his phone and started typing. Brian was reckless. But me? I was smarter. When I realized Brian was working for someone big, I started keeping records. Names, numbers, details. He glanced up. "I don't have the whole picture, but I have enough to make them sweat." Miss Collins' eyes widened. "You have proof." Mason nodded. Not everything, but enough to point the cops in the right direction. Jake felt a flicker of hope. "Then we use it." Miss Collins hesitated. "If we go to the wrong officer, we could be handing over evidence to the same people trying to cover this up." Jake thought for a moment, then said, "Then we go public." Lacey's eyes widened. "What?" "We don't just hand this off to the police. We make sure everyone sees it. News stations, social media, everywhere." He turned to Mason. "Do you have enough to go on record?" Mason exhaled slowly. "Yeah. But once this is out, there's no turning back." Jake nodded. "Good." They pulled into a small diner on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes. Inside, the neon lights flickered, casting a dull glow over the empty booths. Mason set his laptop on the table and started pulling up files. Jake watched as the pieces came together. Names, call logs, financial transactions, all linking back to a group that operated in the shadows, using people like Brian to do their dirty work. And when things got messy, they found someone to take the fall. This time, it had been Jake. Miss Collins called a trusted journalist, someone she knew wouldn't bury the story. Within an hour, they were sitting across from a reporter, showing them everything. The reporter's eyes widened as Mason scrolled through the files. "This is big," she whispered. "If what you're saying is true, this could expose a major operation." Jake leaned forward. "Then expose it." The journalist nodded, taking notes, asking for copies. When they finished, she stood. "This will take time to verify, but once we do, it's going live." Miss Collins stood as well. "Be careful. If they find out what you're working on, they'll try to stop you." The journalist gave a small smile. "Let them try." As she left, a strange mix of relief and fear settled over Jake. They had done what they could. Now, it was in the hands of the world. Days passed, and the tension only grew. Jake barely slept, waiting, watching, wondering when the other shoe would drop. Then, one morning, it happened. The news broke. Reports flooded in. Corruption, crime, cover-ups, all of it laid bare for the public to see. Names were named, investigations were launched, and just like that, the people who had framed Jake were scrambling to protect themselves. One by one, arrests were made. Officers, business figures, people Jake had never even heard of. It was bigger than he had imagined, but now the truth was out, and there was no burying it. Sitting on his porch, Jake watched the sunrise, exhaustion settling over him. He had fought for his life, for justice, and against all odds, he had won. Lacey sat beside him, a small smile on her face. "You did it." Jake shook his head. "We did it." Mason leaned against the railing. "So, what now?" Jake thought for a moment before saying, "Now, I finally get to live my life again." Miss Collins' voice came from the doorway. "And you get to do it as a free man." Jake looked up at her, gratitude in his eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt light. He was finally free.